In the public impeachment hearings so far, Republicans on Capitol Hill stay firm in their defense of President Trump. And looking back at the history of impeachment, that's not too uncommon. According to polls from Gallup, curated by the Pew Research Center, a majority of the public was opposed to removing Richard Nixon until the final months of his presidency. But beyond that, what have members of Congress to say about the process? First, you'll hear from 3 congressional Democrats opposed to the impeachment of Bill Clinton, then 3 Republicans currently opposed to the impeachment of Donald Trump.
I am greatly disappointed in the raw, unmasked, unbridled hatred and meanness that drives this impeachment coup d'etat.
This partisan coup d'etat will go down in infamy in the history of this nation.
These partisan proceedings have made a mockery of our constitutional process. Across the nation, they have been denounced as, and let me quote, a dreadful farce of partisan posturing, a soiling of the Constitution, a circus, a kangaroo court, an attempted coup.
That they are engaged in a partisan show trial, and it's a circus.
What we see in this impeachment is a kangaroo court, and Chairman Schiff is acting like a malicious Captain Kangaroo.
It is clear now more than ever. This is a calculated coup, and it is being orchestrated by Adam Schiff.
Larry Sabato, Patrick Maney, and Mark Summers join me now. Larry is the founder and director of the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Patrick is a professor of modern American history at Boston College and the author of Bill Clinton, New Gilded Age President. And Mark is a history professor at the University of Kentucky and author of A Dangerous Stir, Fear, Paranoia, and the Making of Reconstruction. Welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being with us. We're really excited to talk to you, all 3 of you, about this. So much expertise in one place. So, Larry, let me start with you. We saw that polling on Richard Nixon there, and of course, he resigned. He was never removed from office by impeachment. But help us to understand what it actually took for Republicans to turn on him, because he was going to stick it out until he realized he'd lost Republican support. What happened?
Well, Tanya, you need to remember that he had won 49 states. He, to this day, has the record percentage, 61% of the popular vote. And the American public generally, and particularly Republicans and some independents, had a hard time breaking with him. I've wondered many times if he would have been forced out had there not been the White House taping system that Nixon himself ordered in place. Because it was really the tapes as much as anything else. First the transcripts and then Nixon's actual words that compelled people to reevaluate how they thought about Richard Nixon and whether he was guilty of participating in the cover-up. Obviously, we now know he very much was. But the public was reluctant to believe that, mainly because they thought Nixon was too smart to have done it. He was headed for a landslide win. Why would he do that? And, of course, again, we now know that, in fact, he did everything he could to get the weakest possible Democratic nominee. So that was the start of Watergate in a sense.
So, Patrick, on CNN yesterday, Bill Clinton was asked what his message to President Trump would be about working with Congress during impeachment. Let's listen to what he said.
What would your message to President Trump be about, and when he says, well, I can't work with these people, they're impeaching me?
My message would be, look, you got hired to do a job. You don't get the days back you blow off. Every day is an opportunity to make something good happen. And I would say I've got lawyers and staff people handling this impeachment inquiry, and they should just have at it. Meanwhile, I'm going to work for the American people. That's what I would do.
So how would you then compare President Trump's behavior during impeachment to how Clinton handled himself? Is there something that you can surmise from the way a president handles an impeachment inquiry?
By the way, President Clinton's advice to President Trump was exactly the same as Lindsey Graham gave President Trump about 2 weeks ago, and that was to focus on the job and let others do the defending and the attacking. During the Clinton impeachment, Clinton showed he was not the most disciplined person, but he showed a self-discipline and a focus that he hadn't shown before, and he devoted himself to his job in a way that was really made it the most kind of productive part of his presidency. He let others do the attacking of his and disparaging of his critics. And I should say that Clinton was every bit as angry as President Trump is. Clinton privately said that no president had ever been treated as he was being treated, and he called this a Stalinist show trial. That was in private. In public, he rose above it, and it was that kind of rising above it that kept the public with him, much to the surprise of all of his critics.
So professionally, at least in the office, he was able to tune out the proceedings and sort of focus on the job. That's interesting. Now, Mark, you have studied the first impeachment in American history, Andrew Johnson, in the late 1860s. What precedents then were set by the Johnson impeachment that impacts the process we see today? Because, of course, we know that the Constitution was famously vague about the details of this process.
Yeah. The first presidential impeachment. There were impeachments before that. Well, there's a few of them. One of the pretty important precedents is that it actually has to be a crime that you impeach somebody for. And it has to be a crime that's relatively serious. You can't do it for jaywalking or, for that matter, for reckless driving, even if you run over and kill a pedestrian, which has happened in the past. It's got to be a crime that's of some significance and importance. That's one. There's another that people don't think about much, but it really is a very important precedent. The president is still president while the trial goes on. There was talk in the House about actually suspending him from office so that he wouldn't have any power at all while the trial went on, so he couldn't influence the result or interfere with the result. A third kind of point out there is that everybody in the Senate gets to vote, even if they've got a vested interest in acquittal or in conviction, even if, for example, they're one of the president's in-laws, which in fact was the case in the Johnson case. And finally, I guess there's another kind of principle really involved here, something kind of important, which is don't count on a sure thing. It should have been a slam dunk that Johnson be convicted if it had been a matter of votes. 2/3 and more than 2/3 of the Senate was Republican, and he was a Democrat. 2/3 of the House was Republican, but when it came down to it, he failed of conviction by precisely one vote. About 7 Republicans chose to vote to acquit on the most crucial article.
Well, this sort of leads into a question I have for all of you. I'm hoping that you could weigh in on the actual impeachment process. It seems to be almost intractably difficult to remove a president from office through the process of impeachment. It's never been done, and it appears that it may not happen in our lifetimes because of, the Senate certainly now does not seem that it will ever vote to impeach President Trump and remove him from office. So is that a feature of the impeachment process in this country, or is it a bug of the system that it is so very difficult to remove an American president? Patrick, you first.
There's no question, but it is difficult. But one of the sort of the closest we've come in modern times to a president being impeached and removed from office was during the Nixon administration, and in some ways it set such a high bar for the abuses that occurred. I mean, there was, tampering with evidence and intimidation of witnesses, and it involved abuses of the IRS and the FBI. And what we're having since then have been much more kind of less broad-based abuses. So I think that even makes it harder for impeachment in modern times, certainly with Clinton and now with President Trump.
So, Larry, what do you think? Is it virtually impossible then to remove a president from office through impeachment?
Well, it's certainly very difficult, but it ought to be very difficult, and that's where the 2/3 vote comes in the Senate. Of course, when the founders designed that particular system, they didn't quite imagine the kind of parties that we have today, or even in Johnson's time. We are very, very polarized partisanly. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that you can't imagine anything that President Trump could do that would bring 20 senators who are Republicans to the position that he should be ousted. he should be convicted. So, yes, it is, in a sense, kabuki theater. We have a pretty good idea he's going to be impeached by the House. Democrats are the majority in the House. And we have a pretty good idea that he is not going to be ousted in the Senate. But the process itself is very educational. Let's remember that. People are learning things about this president and probably about the Constitution, too.
Absolutely. So, Mark, could you weigh in? Is the bar for bad behavior raised simply so high now that a president can get away with multiple things before actually reaching that point that Nixon almost reached and to be removed from office?
Johnson got away with multiple things before he was, in fact, impeached. And the House actually tried to impeach him without having a specific crime to impeach him for because he was gumming up the country very, very badly. But the founders were right. They wanted to make sure that impeachment was difficult but not impossible. You don't want a situation where, say, a majority of the Senate can decide to impeach out there. Otherwise, among the founders, nobody expected a Spanish Inquisition. I mean, that's not what we're aiming for. You want to make it something where justice will triumph. But of course, the point that was said before, when the founders wrote the document, they weren't thinking of organized political parties. They were thinking of factions, but certainly not of parties. And I think they assumed that the senators that made their judgment would be judging it as judges and taking their job seriously without letting partisanship define what they thought. And frankly, I think in the case of most of the Republicans who voted to convict and those who voted to acquit with Andrew Johnson, that's exactly what they did. I don't think it was a matter of party that made them decide the way they did.
Do you think if the founders could foresee how partisan we would become, they would tweak the Constitution just a bit when it comes to impeachment? Mark, if you want to.
No, I can't second guess them. They might have. I can't second guess them on that. I don't know.
All right. Well, we've really enjoyed this discussion. Presidential historians Larry Sabato, Patrick Maney, and Mark Summers. Thanks to all of you. We really, really enjoyed this discussion. Thanks so much.